So this makes sure that whenever this completes successfully, which we're forcing it to complete successfully, that it will always return a right hand type. Now back to this. How do we make sure that we get the proper data from the repository implementation? We simply create these. We create these and then we make sure that those values that we passed in here are the same values that reflect in here. Right, so this is basically what we're saying. We're saying that our final created at will be equal to, I don't know, whatever you want to call that. Whatever. Now, what have we got here? Const, copy that, paste. Now, essentially what we're saying is call the create user and give it created at, this name, and this avatar. Now, when we're verifying to make sure that the create user got called. 1. 2, we're verifying to make sure that it got called with the same values that were here. So if let me go ahead. So if when we're calling the remote data source.create user from the repository implementation, if when we're doing that, we're passing the wrong value instead of passing in the actual value that was from the repo implementation, then this test will fail. And then finally, we want to verify no more interactions with our remote data source. We want to make sure that nothing invokes remote data source again after we use it. So you will understand this a little better when we start writing the implementation. Now we're in the phase 1 of our test, which is what? The red phase, which is where your test will fail because you haven't actually implemented it. So this is our test. This is what we want to make sure. We want to make sure that this is the case. How do we make sure that that's the case? We can see it's failing because it's unimplemented error. We haven't implemented it yet. So we can go ahead in here, and what is the test that we just wrote? The test that we just wrote is trying to make sure that 1, we call a remote data source. And how are we going to do that? We're simply going to do await, await remote data source, which is the whatever remote data source that got passed in here. Remember, and now it's important because in our test, we've passed in a mock version of that remote data source. So we're basically using this data source that we're controlling. So over here we're controlling its return type. So in here, whatever data source, when we're actually using this class in our actual application, we're going to be passing in a different remote data source that we've created, not a mock version. So but then even in this case, look how beautiful this is. In this case, we're passing in a mock version that we're going to be controlling its functionalities. So even whenever this class is running in a test, or whether it's running in an actual instance of the application, it will still work in both cases because it's taking that instance in its constructor. So we can go ahead and say that to make sure that we're calling the remote data source, in order to make sure that that particular test is passing, we're going to do remote data source.create user, right? And also in order to make sure that the test where we're checking to verify that it gets called with the right data, we're going to pass in the actual data that we have in here. So now this will actually, so for now I'm going to return just a right null, just for this function to stop screaming at me. So now the first test is going to pass, right? We're trying to make sure that this part, the verified part, works. So I'm going to go back and rerun the test. So let's go ahead and run the test. You can just run the group if you wanted to, but I'm just going to run the entire thing. So let's see if this test passes. So we can see that the test has passed, right? But then imagine that inside of this place I made a mistake. And instead of passing in the creator that I had over there, I passed in a different creator that. So just a random different creator that. Remember that the actual creator that we're passing in is this, whatever creator that. This is what we're calling and we're passing it in there. So in here, when we receive this, I'm going to pass in the wrong one. You can see that the test will fail. So if you make such errors, the test will alert you. It will fail. And that failure will alert you. Right, so no matching calls. There was no matching calls because we have a different creator that. Meanwhile, in our actual test, we're passing in whatever dot creator that, not a different creator that. However, in this case, this will pass. And now we also want to make sure that the return type is correct. So we want to make sure that we return the results, whatever result we get from this. So this person actually doesn't have a result. So we can either say final result or whatever. But since it's void, you can leave this way and always return a right null. Remember I told you when your function returns void, in here you always want to return a null. So I'm going to make that constant and the first test passes. Now finally, remember we have a different test as well. So we've completed the test to make sure that it calls the remote data source. We've also completed to make sure that it returns the proper data, in this case a right null if there's no exception. Now what if there's an exception? Let's go ahead and fake an exception. So inside of the same group we create a different test, and this test should return a server failure, this time a failure, or a server failure rather. Let me just call the server failure when the call to the remote source is unsuccessful. Cut that, save that. Now we want to make sure that whenever a call to the remote source is unsuccessful, that the implementation of our repository returns a left server failure. You could actually make that left rather server failure, but I just prefer to write the actual return type of the left or right. So we have async. Now we're actually going to mock or stub. This is called stubbing. Remember, we're actually going to stub the hijack the remote data source. So now we're saying that whenever the remote data source .create user gets called with any of these, let me copy the arguments. Remote data source .create user, whenever it gets called with any of these, paste. Then throw. What am I doing wrong? Then throw. What are we throwing? So we're going to be throwing, in this case, a server exception. I haven't explained this bit to you yet, but so for now we have failures. In our data sources, when we catch an exception, remember I told you we don't want to throw the raw exception. We want to convert it into our own defined user-defined exception. So we're going to be defining our own exceptions, which is going to be an implementation of the actual Flutter or Dart exception.